Another very effective tool for storing and remembering information that we've super learned is a technique called memory palaces. Memory palaces are basically imaginary buildings or structures that you create in your mind to fill and populate with detailed memories. Each story or piece of information is represented by an imaginary physical object, which is then placed in a specific area, whether it be on the ground, on a bookshelf, on the counter, in the cupboard, or dangling from a lamp. These areas where memories can be stored are called loci, and they become anchor points. The core of the technique involves using your imagination to walk through this very familiar area in a linear fashion, making sure not to cross your own path. As you go through the memory journey, you place objects in memorable areas. Now, I used to be very ambivalent about memory palaces because I was too lazy to invest the time in creating my own memory palaces. And so I would store my visual markers haphazardly, without any order or organization. However, the more I researched and interacted with many experts on memory palaces, the more I realized that this technique is actually used by each and every memory champion, without exception. This is for a couple of reasons. Number one, our brains are extremely effective at remembering where things are and visualizing them. This is related to the evolutionary skills that we talked about earlier. If you remember exactly where the berry tree is in a massive field, or exactly where you buried your winter food supply, that can be a huge survival advantage. This effect is so powerful that I bet if you close your eyes right now, you can probably tell me exactly where the shampoo and conditioner bottles are in your shower. You can probably even tell me what order they're in. Now this is pretty amazing, and your brain does it completely naturally. Number two is that this technique is very effective at helping us index events. We can remember events in chronological orders, which is really important for things like memorizing speeches. We can even remember things in reverse order if we go through our memory journey backwards. In fact, this technique is so effective that it's been used for thousands of years, ever since the 5th century BC. The legend goes that the Greek poet Simonides was at a banquet hall crowded with people and left for a few minutes only to find that the banquet hall had collapsed. There were no other survivors, and there was no way to identify the crushed casualties or even know where they were under the rubble. In that moment, Simonides realized that if he closed his eyes, he could remember exactly where each person had been sitting, even though he had not really been paying attention over the wine and food and merriment of the banquet. He was able to take each hysterical relative by the hand to the exact place where their loved one had been sitting. In this moment, the memory palace was supposedly born, and for thousands of years after that, until the popularity of the printing press, memory palaces were what was used to memorize huge volumes of information. In fact, researchers have recently determined that the entire works of Homer, Plato, and Socrates were likely committed to memory using memory palaces, and only later were they written down. So how do you take advantage of this technique? The first step is to create at least one, but probably a few more, empty palaces. These palaces can be your childhood home, a building once seen, or even a building that you make up. In fact, most people who use this technique have many different memory palaces for different types of memories. For example, you could have one building for your Spanish vocabulary and a different one for personal information, such as birthdays and credit card numbers. Once you create the palace, you need to clear off the shelves and make space for new objects to be placed. Then, it's time to start practicing placing your markers in strategic areas. Now, I want to take a quick second to say that memory palaces are not used for everything. For example, it would be extremely difficult to use the loci method and walk through an entire imaginary house while we're speed reading. And so we can't really use this technique while we read. We just have to link the markers as we go. But memory palaces are great for memorizing stories, order of events, lists of items, and things like that, but only when we have the time to carefully populate a memory palace. So If you read something, for example, and you want to store the content into a memory palace for long-term storage, that's something that you should do at the end of the chapter, not while you're reading. There are a lot of amazing resources involving memory palaces, and they go into much more detail than I can in just one lecture. First, I'm going to refer you to a TED Talk by the US memory champion Joshua Foer, where he explains how people are able to memorize 34 decks of playing cards back to back using memory temples. Next, I'm going to link you to Foer's recent book, Moonwalking with Einstein, which I strongly recommend as homework for this course. Finally, I'm going to link you to a Udemy course, a blog, a book, and a podcast by Dr. Anthony Metivier. Anthony is a friend of mine and a fellow Udemy instructor, and he's made an entire career out of teaching the magnetic memory method, a system based on creating and adapting memory palaces. He's written a number of books, released a number of courses, and is a very active blogger and podcaster on the subject. In fact, it was actually Anthony who convinced me to invest in my own memory palaces, and he continues to help me develop the skill as time goes on. These days, I use the technique for even the simplest of things. One little hack I really like is to adapt the technique to my meditation practice. As a beginner in meditation, my brain immediately calls up all of the things I need to remember and need to do, and it has some of the best ideas when I'm trying to concentrate on meditation. The standard practice is to observe the thoughts and to let them pass, which I do. But before I let these strokes of inspiration pass, I make a quick mental marker. For example, if I want to remember to post a poll on the Super Learner Facebook group, I create a mental marker, a Facebook, and a voting poll, and a screenshot, and I place it on an imagined bookshelf. This allows me to move on and let the thought go with ease. By the time I finish my normal meditation session, I may have 4 or 5 reminders. And I've been really amazed by how well the Loci method works. Even a month later, I remember all of these markers, where they are on the bookshelf, and exactly what each one of them represents, even without using the correct walking through method. I recently was interviewed by someone who read Joshua Foer's book and had done the practice exercise of memorizing a random grocery list. 5 years later, he was able to remember over half the list that Foer details in the book. Totally amazing. So your homework is to check out the supplementary materials and memorize your entire to-do list or grocery shopping list using Loci and visual markers. Get funky and outrageous with them. You can turn Email Boss into a picture of Bowser, the big boss from Mario Brothers, sitting at a computer. Or you can turn Wash the Car into 2 bikini-clad beauties sponging your car. Because you've become so skilled at creating detailed and creative markers by now, it really shouldn't be a problem. Don't make the mistake I made for years and stubbornly neglect the memory palace technique. It can make a massive difference on your memory capacity, so check it out.